What if I told you that one of the most extraordinary UFO encounters in U.S. history didn't happen to a fighter pilot or a general, but to an ordinary baggage handler working the night shift at an airport you've probably never even heard of? No classified clearance, no special training. Just a man doing his job when he stumbled into something that changed his life forever and nearly cost him everything. The date was November 7th, 2006. Chicago O'Hare International Airport, one of the busiest hubs in America, was already straining under a heavy schedule of flights. But while most passengers were busy worrying about delays and lost luggage, 34-year-old ground operations worker Michael Torres was about to see something no safety manual had prepared him for. It was just past 4:30 p.m. when Michael was guiding a United Airlines 737 toward Gate C-17. The November sky was gray and overcast, with low clouds that made the entire ramp look like it was trapped inside a giant metal dome. As the jet engines wound down, Michael noticed something strange. Several ramp workers were pointing upward, their orange wands forgotten in their hands. Curious, he turned and froze. Hovering silently just above the terminal, maybe 500 feet up, was a dark, disc-shaped object. No lights, no sound, just a perfectly round, metallic craft, blending eerily with the clouds. Michael's first thought was that it was some kind of balloon, but balloons don't hold perfectly still against the wind, balloons don't cast shadows on the concrete, and balloons don't punch holes in clouds. The object lingered, completely motionless. Pilots in the cockpit of the 737 radioed the tower, demanding to know what it was. Air traffic controllers later admitted they saw nothing on radar. But dozens of witnesses on the ground and in the terminal saw the same thing. A silent disk hovering in broad daylight over one of the busiest airports in the world. Then, in an instant, it shot upward, piercing the low cloud cover and leaving behind a perfectly round hole in the sky that stayed visible for nearly 15 minutes. Michael said the moment it disappeared, the ramp felt like the air had changed, like static before a storm. Workers looked at each other, some laughing nervously, others refusing to speak. But they all knew what they had seen. That night, Michael tried to talk about it in the break room, but a supervisor shut him down. "We don't discuss things like that on duty," the man said sharply. The next day, airline managers held a closed-door meeting with several witnesses, reminding them that spreading false rumors could result in termination. Yet the story leaked anyway. Someone tipped off the Chicago Tribune, and by November 14th, the incident was headline news. The FAA dismissed it as weather phenomena, but privately, Michael and his co-workers knew better. He described the object as controlled, deliberate, almost like it was observing. And if something with that kind of technology could hover silently above O'Hare in the middle of rush hour and then vanish into the clouds at impossible speed, the real question wasn't what it was, but why it was there. In the days following the sighting at O'Hare, Michael Torres couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, as if just by looking up at the sky that afternoon he had crossed an invisible line. And soon enough the consequences started to show. On November 10th, 3 days after the object vanished into the clouds, 2 men in plain suits approached him near the employee parking lot, flashing federal-style badges without giving names, and asked pointed questions about what exactly he had seen and whether he had spoken to reporters. When Michael hesitated, one of the men leaned in and said quietly, "For your own sake, you should forget what you think you saw." They left without another word. But that same evening he noticed an unfamiliar black sedan idling near his apartment complex. Lights off, engine running. He told himself it was coincidence, but the next morning the car was there again. At work, talk of the sighting spread like wildfire among baggage handlers, mechanics, and even some of the pilots. Yet whenever conversations got serious, a supervisor would walk in, reminding everyone that rumors and distractions would not be tolerated. Still, the story slipped out. On November 14th, the Chicago Tribune published a piece citing anonymous airline employees who described a disc-shaped craft hovering over Gate C-17. The article quoted multiple witnesses, some of them high-level pilots, and within hours it exploded across national news outlets. CNN ran a segment, talk radio buzzed, and UFO researchers from across the country descended on Chicago, demanding answers. The FAA quickly issued a statement claiming radar had shown nothing unusual, suggesting it was a weather anomaly, perhaps a hole punch cloud. To most of the public, that was enough to move on. But to those who had been there on the ramp, like Michael, the official explanation felt like an insult. The hole in the clouds had been too perfect, too sudden, too obviously cut by something powerful. One mechanic who spoke anonymously said, "That thing wasn't ours, I can tell you that much. We don't have anything that moves like that. Not at O'Hare, not anywhere." Within weeks, however, pressure mounted. Employees were called individually into closed-door meetings with airline security and told to keep quiet or risk their jobs. Michael himself received a formal warning placed in his file after he admitted to a reporter that he had seen the object with his own eyes. Soon after, some of his closest co-workers began avoiding him, as if they were afraid being near him would put them on the wrong list. Then came the moment that convinced Michael something much larger was happening. In January 2007, 2 months after the sighting, he received an anonymous letter slipped under his apartment door. It was typed and signed and said only, "Do not pursue this. The others have already agreed. It was not for you." That single sentence rattled him more than the disc itself. Who were the others? What had they agreed to? And why was he singled out? By spring, Michael's life was unraveling. He was passed over for promotions, shifts were cut, and eventually he was transferred to night duty far from the main terminals. Still, he kept notes, writing down every detail of what he remembered, every conversation, every odd occurrence. Years later, those notes would become the backbone of an underground report circulated among UFO researchers, known as the Torres Papers. But at the time, he had no idea his private journal would ever be seen by anyone else. Meanwhile, witnesses kept disappearing from public discussion. A United Airlines pilot who had spoken to the Tribune retracted his statements, saying he had been misquoted. Another ramp worker resigned suddenly and moved out of state. Even Daniel, a mechanic Michael trusted, stopped answering his calls. It was as if someone had gone through and systematically silenced anyone who had dared to confirm the story. But Michael refused to let it go. Even as the official narrative hardened, nothing happened. It was a weather trick, case closed. And yet the question gnawed at him. If it was nothing, why had so many people been threatened, relocated, or erased? Why was his own life turned upside down? And what kind of craft could hover, completely silent, above one of the busiest airports in the world in broad daylight, as if daring someone to notice? By 2012, nearly 6 years had passed since the O'Hare sighting, and Michael Torres was no longer the same man who had stood on that freezing tarmac staring into the clouds. His career had faltered, his marriage had collapsed under the weight of paranoia and stress, and he spent his nights obsessively combing through forums, digging through FAA reports, and connecting with anyone who claimed to have inside knowledge of what had happened that day in Chicago. Most leads went nowhere, but every now and then he found a fragment that made his heart race. One evening in March 2012, Michael received an email from a former FAA employee who called himself Harlan. The message was brief: "You're not crazy. O'Hare was flagged as a high-interest event. Look into Special Activity Report 94-21. That was it. No explanation. Michael spent weeks trying to track down what SAR 94-21 meant. Eventually, through contacts in the UFO research community, he discovered that SAR was an internal FAA designation used for anomalous aerial activity affecting commercial operations. The numbering suggested that O'Hare was not the first, but one of many. In fact, documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests showed at least 17 separate SARs filed between 1994 and 2006, scattered across major U.S. airports, always dismissed publicly as weather, balloons, or pilot error. Michael realized then that what he had seen was part of a much larger pattern. In 2014, he flew to Phoenix, Arizona, to attend a closed conference of aviation professionals willing to talk about UFOs off the record. There, he met Captain James Price, a retired pilot who admitted he had once intercepted an object over Denver International in 1999. Price described it as a metallic disc that blinked out of sight the moment his jet approached. He leaned close to Michael and said, "They wanted to know how we'd react. That's the test. Always the test." The words sent chills through him because they echoed what he'd heard whispered years earlier about Holloman AFB, that the encounters were deliberate, staged, observed. Could O'Hare have been the same? A carefully orchestrated exposure, not an accident? By 2016, Michael's Torres papers, his private notes expanded with documents and witness testimonies, had been leaked online. At first, only fringe UFO forums discussed them, but soon journalists began sniffing around. In December 2017, when the New York Times broke the story of ADIP, the Pentagon's secret UFO study program, Michael nearly fell out of his chair. Among the list of investigated cases was a reference to Chicago O'Hare, 2006, mass civilian and commercial airline witness event, unexplained aerial phenomena. It was the validation he had waited over a decade for, the proof that the government had not dismissed O'Hare as weather at all. But with that validation came new danger. In January 2018, Michael's apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen except his laptop and a locked box containing his original handwritten journals. Police called it a burglary, but he knew better. Whoever had been watching him since 2006 had decided he'd gotten too close again. Yet in a strange way, it only confirmed that the story wasn't over. In the years that followed, Michael began connecting his sighting to other incidents. The Phoenix Lights of 1997, the Stephenville, Texas encounter of 2008, and multiple reports from airline pilots who saw discs and triangles pacing their jets across the Midwest. The more he mapped them, the more it looked like an invisible grid across America's skies, as if someone, or something, was conducting surveys, timing their appearances, testing human reactions in controlled environments. And the hole in the clouds above O'Hare, that perfect circle left behind in November 2006, remained burned into his memory. Sometimes, late at night, he would look up at the sky and wonder if that had been a message, a signature, a way of saying, "We were here, we are still here, and you can't hide us forever." By the time the 2020s arrived, Michael Torres was no longer just a baggage handler who had seen something strange in the sky. He had become an unwilling archivist of one of the most important UFO cases in American history, a man whose name circulated quietly among researchers, journalists, and even ex-military officers who couldn't speak openly but wanted someone out there to keep the truth alive. In 2020, when the Pentagon officially released UFO footage showing objects performing impossible maneuvers, Michael knew the narrative had shifted, but he also knew something even bigger was coming. In March 2021, he was contacted by a woman who identified herself only as Elena, claiming to be a former contractor at the FAA. She told him that O'Hare had been more than an anomaly. It had been flagged as a Category Black event, a designation reserved for cases where unidentified aerial phenomena directly intersected with critical civilian infrastructure. "You weren't supposed to see it," she told him over the phone, her voice shaking. "But they wanted to know what you'd do if you did." The words haunted Michael for months. In June 2022, during congressional hearings on UAPs, a whistleblower named David Grush testified under oath that the U.S. government possessed non-human technology and had engaged in decades-long cover-ups. Listening to the testimony, Michael felt the blood drain from his face. For years he had been dismissed, threatened, ridiculed, yet here was a decorated intelligence officer telling Congress essentially what he had known since that November day in 2006, that the disk above O'Hare was no illusion, no weather phenomenon, but a piece of technology not of this earth, or at least not made by human hands. After that, Michael began to receive strange messages online, anonymous emails with fragments of declassified documents, references to observation protocols, and civilian exposure trials. One document, stamped 1997, described an aerial insertion above a major U.S. hub, with the goal of monitoring psychological and operational responses of untrained civilian witnesses. The date wasn't O'Hare, but the description was identical: a disc-shaped craft hovering above an airport, vanishing into the clouds, leaving behind atmospheric anomalies. It dawned on Michael that O'Hare wasn't unique at all. It was just the latest in a series of controlled displays. By 2023, his health was failing, years of stress and paranoia taking their toll. But before he grew too weak, he decided to record one final testimony. In a dimly lit hotel room in Denver, he sat in front of a camera and told the story from the beginning. The ramp, the disc, the hole in the clouds, the men in suits, the letters, the threats, the theft of his journals, everything he had carried silently for nearly 2 decades. He ended with a warning. They're not testing their craft. They're testing us. Every sighting, every incident. It's not about showing off what they can do. It's about seeing how much we'll tolerate, how much we'll ignore, how easily we can be silenced. The real question isn't if they're here. The real question is what they're waiting for. Weeks later, Michael Torres died quietly in his sleep. His testimony leaked online by unknown hands. Some dismissed it as the ravings of a man obsessed. Others studied it line by line, cross-referencing dates, names, and details with known cases. And though no government agency has ever admitted it, the incident at O'Hare International Airport on November 7, 2006 remains one of the most credible UFO sightings in history, witnessed by dozens of airline staff, pilots, and passengers, all describing the same impossible craft hovering above one of the busiest airports in America. To this day, some nights when the sky is overcast and clouds hang low over Chicago, ground crews swear they see strange lights shimmering silently above the terminals, as if the visitors have never really left. And maybe they haven't.